Hello, Adam and everyone. Thank you for logging in today. Some are still trying to get on, and I'm sending links through. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Susanna Kokkonen in the first of series on anti-Semitism. Susanna is a dear friend of ours. We came to know of Susanna about 12 years ago when she came on as a director of the Christian Friends of Yad Vashem, where she was for 10 years serving. She's originally from Finland, has her doctorate from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her expertise is in Holocaust studies. She is a world traveler and has lived and worked in several different countries. She speaks 7 languages and frequently lectures around the world on topics such as the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and persecution. She is a contributor on print and electronic media and often appears as a guest on TV and radio shows. She has toured across Canada. We had her as our guest on many, many occasions from east to west. And her new book out is available on Amazon, is Journey to the Holocaust, Hatred of Jews in Light of the Bible and History. We also have Christine Williams as our public affairs and media consultant for the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem, Canada. She produces our Inside Israel for us with ICEJ Canada on Daystar Media Weekly. She is a 9-time international award-winning journalist and TV producer. She holds 2 federal government appointments and has served on the Anti-Semitism Task Force for Simon Wiesenthal in Toronto and is on the board of advisors for Muslims Facing Tomorrow. She's a political columnist and has served on the board of governors for the Gatestone Institute and as a senior advisor to the Hudson Institute in New York. Her writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Front Page Magazine, Jihad Watch, USA Today, Metro News, Breaking Israel News, and Media East Quarterly. She has also authored the books, The Challenge of Islamic Reform and Fired by the Canadian Government, both available on Amazon. Please welcome our guests today.
Now, thank you so much for that introduction, Donna. Now, before we go and listen to the wonderful message by Susanna, I want to just give you a little bit of a view on some of what she's addressing today, because it's a very pertinent time to address this today, particularly what we see developing in the news. She'll address questions like, do we see medieval anti-Semitism present in our society today? What is the enduring legacy of traditional Christian anti-Semitism that we need to be aware of? And once she's finished, we're going to open up to you watching with her questions, and we'll answer those questions. Now, without further ado, we're going to ask Susanna to come on and deliver her message.
Well, thank you very much for ICEJ Canada for having me with you today. And what I want to do in this series of 3 lectures is to show how anti-Semitism, how it has these ancient roots and how it comes from far back, and how in a way this crisis that we have been experiencing since March, some countries even earlier, how this has actually brought out a lot of these very ancient accusations. And today we want to talk about the Middle Ages, because that's a very critical, very important period in this history. And I will actually go further back and start from the antiquity. But let me start with the Bible. The verse that you see up on the screen, it's Ezekiel 35:5. And it actually uses this expression, ancient hatred. Because you have had an ancient hatred and have shed the blood of the children of Israel by the power of the sword at the time of their calamity, when their iniquity came to an end. Therefore, as I live, says the Lord God, I will prepare you for blood, and blood shall pursue you. And this kind of sets the tone for this session, because what I want to show you is that we actually have even the background of the Holocaust when we go back to the Middle Ages. I am sorry, I have to, yes. So we go to antiquity, and just because we are talking about ancient history, to make sure that we are all on the same page, what we call antiquity, we mean about the 8th century before Christ and up to the 6th century AD. And why is this so important to understand these dates? Well, if you look at them, you see that actually Jesus, everything that happens in Jesus's life, and then the first church, all of that falls in that period. And that's the period of the Greek Empire and then the Roman Empire. And of course, Greek comes to be very, very important in how we read the Bible today. Greek culture dominates even the Roman Empire. And the question really is, do we already find something anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic when we go so far back in time? Well, one of the important Jewish communities at the time was the Alexandrian Jewish community in Egypt. And there we find the first anti-Semitic writings in 270 BC. Now, why is that community so important? Well, they experienced violence. It wasn't just writing, there were also violent attacks against them. And they are the community that gave us the first translation to Greek of the Old Testament. So it's a very important religious aspect we have there. But the other thing is that we want to understand what type of hatred it was. Was it ethnic or was it religious? And what we really find is that we have ethnic hatred, and that ethnic hatred would be against all different communities. It wouldn't be just the Jews. But then we have a very big difference between the Jews and all the others. Now, when we think about Greece, Greek culture dominating, we know that the Greeks, they had all these gods that man had created, and they acted just like men. They argued, they did different things. And what do we have in Judaism? We have God who created man. And man is supposed to aspire to behave more and more in a way that God wants. So we have a major difference. It's really impossible for this monotheistic system to exist with all these many gods. So I would say that here we can already see that we have ethnic hatred, but we also have an issue of religion. And this is also important because one of the most enduring anti-Jewish myths, and I'm going to look at it later, is what we call blood libel or ritual murder accusation. The accusation that Jews would kidnap a non-Jewish child, sometimes it was depicted as an adult, and they would then use their blood and their body, and they would do something horrible, or they would bake the Easter Passover bread. So this is where we have that accusation for the first time. And I want to move on and discuss a little bit the Bible, because the biblical events are happening at the same time. And I want to go now to the Bible, and I want to go to Romans chapter 11. And the reason I'm going here is that this is a verse I assume everybody is going to be very familiar with. And I read from verses 16 to 18. For if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root is holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and the fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. And now, very often when we read this verse, we know what it is about. We understand that Paul is talking to Gentiles and he is saying, don't be so proud because God chose the Jewish people and you have been grafted in. But the question really is, why is he saying that? Why is it so important? Why does he write that to the church in Rome? And it's very interesting that we find the historical background in Roman sources. Roman sources discuss what happened, but we also find it in the book of Acts. So in Acts 18, verses 1 to 2, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. Okay, so we know from these Roman historians, and it's then confirmed in the book of Acts, that Caesar Claudius several times actually expelled the Jews from Rome. And Paul actually travels around 44 AD, that's when he started. So we can clearly see that he's writing to the church in Rome because Jews had been cast out, they had been expelled, and when they tried to return, they were no longer welcome. And this is the background. So we saw that in the antiquity, the Jewish monotheistic system could kind of not exist with the Greek religious system. And now we have the apostles still alive. And we have Paul already addressing a problem between the Gentiles and the Jews. It's no wonder then that when we come to the church fathers, we already see clearly that creating a difference between Judaism and the new Christian religion becomes very quickly very important to them. The first church fathers, we talk about apostolic church fathers because they have been contemporaries of the apostles. It is commonly believed that some of them actually met with the apostles. But already what is really important is that already most of them are actually writing in what language? Not in Hebrew, in Greek. So the whole separation, it actually already started here. And of course, the further away we go from the apostles, the more we see this. And here I want to show to you, just for a moment, I put down some names and some dates. So first of all, you can see the dates. Justin Martyr. He lived very close to Paul, very close to the apostles, because some people suggest that the apostle John would have died around 98 AD. So they would have been practically contemporaries. But Justin Martyr is very famous for his view on the Jews. What does he say? He believes that the Jews are still clinging to the old ways, that truth has come to the world, but they are just clinging to those old things that are no longer important. The real, I would say, watershed moment, the kind of like the most important moment in this story, I believe, is the 325 AD Nicene Council. And this is very important for different reasons. First of all, because it's the first time, it's like the first ecumenical council meeting. But second of all, who is actually in charge? Who would be the person that would be in charge here? This is Constantine first. And I think that's important because here we already have this secular power, this state power that is actually influencing, that is actually becoming very important in church affairs. And I mentioned here two church fathers who are both very, very important. And one of them is Augustinus, or Augustine. And he actually thought quite a lot about the Jews, so I just want to read to you very shortly what he had to say. The Bible does not say, "Cursed is the earth," but rather, "You are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood at your hand." So the unbelieving people of the Jews is cursed from the earth, that is, from the church, which in the confession of sins has opened its mouth to receive the blood shed for the remission of sins by the hand of the people that has chosen not to be under grace, but rather to exist under the law. And this murderer is cursed by the church. So the Jew is the murderer, and the Jew is cursed from the earth and cursed by the church. And I want to continue just with John Chrysostom. What does he say about the Jews? Jews are dogs, stiff-necked, gluttonous drunkards. They are beasts unfit for work. The synagogue is worse than a brothel and a drinking shop. It is a den of scoundrels, a temple of demons, and so on and so forth. Now, very often I met Christians who were very critical of Jewish writings, of the Talmud or the Mishnah, different writings. But I want us now to consider for a moment, what did you just hear? These have to be the most anti-Jewish, the most horrible things that you would hear. In fact, today, I believe that you would be taken to the court if you spoke like that. But the fact that they said these things, it still doesn't cancel that they also said some things that were very important for the church. So this is something that we need to consider, that in our church history, in the church fathers' history, we have many elements that are actually very difficult, very hard to understand. So then, of course, we come to the Reformation. And we think, okay, but the Reformation changed everything because now people were able to read the Bible in their own language. Well, that would change a lot of things, and we are all forever grateful for that. But unfortunately, even though these great reformers, even though they did all these things that we now enjoy the word of God in our own language and everything, still they were children of their own time. They were still born in that spirit where anti-Semitism was such a strong part of everyday life of the society. So what did Martin Luther say? What should be done to this rejected and condemned Jewish race? First, to set fire to their synagogues or schools, and to bury and cover with dirt whatever will not burn. Second, I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed. Third, I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings, in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught, be taken from them. We should eject them forever from this country. And this, of course, happens about 500 years later in the Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, when synagogues are burned, prayer books are burned, Talmuds are burned, and the people are ejected from that country. These are very, very serious things. So what were the main accusations against the Jews? And how are we to deal with these accusations when we still hear them today? Now, the first one, I'm pretty sure that everybody is familiar with. In Latin, it was called deicide. And this is the concept that Jews have murdered God, and therefore they need to receive a punishment. There's actually no punishment that is fitting for such a monumental crime. But we, as Christians, we are going to be a part of that punishment. So the continuous persecution of the Jews is kind of proof that God is punishing them, even though it's us as Christians who are doing that punishing. So I wrote some Bible verses for you, but let me just read one, because this is Jesus speaking, and the disciples are very sad because Jesus, they think, has died, and they don't know why and what happened. And this is in Luke 24, verses 25 to 27. Then he said to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory?" And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So Jesus had a destiny, and the Bible says that he came to fulfill his Father's will. And therefore, everything that happened to Jesus, that is why we have our salvation. Now, the second accusation, we traditionally actually call it the superstition myth or replacement theology, the idea that Christians have replaced Jews in God's purposes, that the Jews are no longer in any special position. Now, today, very often people actually call it fulfillment theology, meaning that Jesus came to fulfill all the prophecies, and therefore everything has been fulfilled with the church, and therefore there is no longer any specific destiny for the Jewish people. I want to identify a verse where I feel that God says that they will never cease to exist as a nation, and that is Jeremiah 31, verses 35 to 36. Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for a light by day, the ordinances of the moon and the stars for a light by night, who disturbs the seas and its waves row, the Lord of hosts is his name. If those ordinances depart from before me, says the Lord, then the seed of Israel shall also cease from being a nation before me forever. And then Jesus himself in Acts 1, verse 7, the disciples asked him, when will you restore the kingdom to Israel? He doesn't say, I won't do it, because that is no longer important. He says, it's not up to you to know the times that the Father himself has decided. Luke 21:24, the times of the Gentiles in Jerusalem will be fulfilled. Now, we move away now from that biblical period, and we move towards the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages, we don't really have like these dates that are certain for every area. We are talking about the whole world, and different things change in different places, but roughly from the 5th century until 1500. And what do we have? Slowly but surely the Roman Empire is disintegrating. There are many reasons for that. The Roman Empire is attacked from every side. There's a lot of moral corruption inside the Imperium. And also it's split in two. So we have the Western Roman Empire, which is what I'm talking about here. And then we have the Eastern part. And it's hard for us to think about an entire civilization disappearing. But that's what happens. So for example, just for us to get an idea, in Rome, the legal system functioned. It was a very advanced legal system, but suddenly that just disappeared. Or they had built roads all over Europe. All of that just disappears. So when the Roman Empire collapsed and that civilization was no longer there, what we see first is the lack of central authority. There's no authority. And that's why the church becomes the central authority, with the consequence that the church is so powerful that even kings kings have to be approved by the church, and many of the church leaders, they are not living poor lives, but they are actually wealthier than the princes who govern certain areas. And this is especially visible towards the end of the Middle Ages. There's a lot of corruption in the church. The person who lives, the regular normal person in that period knows that they have to obey first and foremost the church, and then they have kind of a dual identity, a dual loyalty. Then they also will obey the local government, the prince or the duke who is in charge. Why is this so important? When we looked at the accusations against the Jews, we would say that those are primarily theological. But when church becomes central authority, and when actually church becomes the most powerful institution there is, it's no longer just theology, because now the church actually owns a lot of land. The church actually is able to legislate. And so this theology becomes social law where the Jews are residing. And this has very, very big consequences to their lives. And I want to look at this one thing, one accusation more specifically. At the beginning, I mentioned that already in the antiquity, we had this accusation, what we call blood libel or ritual murder. And my goal in these presentations is to show that everything continues, that there is a kind of something enduring, that this ancient hatred never dies, it continues. So here we can see it very clearly, because blood libel has survived Middle Ages, it has survived Nazism, and today it's also expressed very often against the state of Israel. So here you can see this picture from the Middle Ages, and there is a non-Jewish child has been taken by people who are clearly identified as Jews because of their head coverings. And everybody would understand that something evil is about to happen. They are going to do something terrible with this child. And this is very interesting because the central element, if you look at the picture on the left side, is blood. There is a lot of blood, and this man is building a wall, and he is using bodies, and he is using blood. And in Judaism, as you know, in the Torah, there are very, very strong commandments against this kind of thing. You cannot use blood, you cannot eat blood, nothing like that. Well, anyway, so in the picture that comes from the Sunday Times, it actually comes from 2013, but the day is interesting. It's the 27th of January. So we all know that that would be the International Holocaust Memorial Day. But the day before, if you look at the very small text in the picture, it says Israeli elections. Well, it's Israeli elections because Prime Minister Netanyahu, in the only democratic elections in the Middle East, the day before had been elected, had been given the mandate to lead the country again. Now look at Prime Minister Netanyahu. You recognize him as the Prime Minister because his face is clearly the Prime Minister's face. But I was reading something about this, that a person who understands about art and what you convey with visuals was talking about this picture, that even the shirt that the Prime Minister is wearing in this picture, this is the kind of shirt that the villains, the horrible men, would wear in American movies. So everything in this picture is very carefully thought of. And you see, when people called the Sunday Times and were very upset, all they had to say was that this had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. So I want to show you, this picture doesn't really describe but it's from this newspaper, Aftonbladet, from Sweden. And the article that they wrote, it's still online. I found that it was also copied by a number of publications. So the picture is a Palestinian young man who is going to throw Molotov cocktails. But the text is what it says. It says that Israel is taking organs of these Palestinian young men. Now, I want you to remember this, because this is also a variation of blood libel, like a modern variation of blood libel. They don't say that they are using their blood, but they say that they are actually taking their organs. And this is very, very sick, because in the rabbinic world, and the rabbis in Israel have been, and there are some who are still speaking about this, that is it even permitted to accept an organ transplant? What does the Jewish law say about organ transplants? And in 2008, Israel enacted laws about this. It's something that is completely impossible, that this kind of thing would ever happen in a small country like Israel, where everybody knows each other, where everybody knows where these Palestinians, if they are even arrested, where they would be held, and so on. So this is the modern version of blood libel, and it's repeated in different publications in slightly different ways. So now I want to come to what is so interesting about the Middle Ages, and it is the Black Death. This actually raged. You can see from the map that it's a very big area where we have all of that black, means that there were many, many people who were dying in those places. It actually raged for many years, but the peak years are the ones that I wrote, 1348 to 53 or so. And people often say that 25 million people died, but actually some researchers say that it was more like 50 million people. So it's a huge number. So imagine now that you are living in the Middle Ages. You don't know how to read, maybe, especially if you come from the kind of poorer groups of people. And you don't understand what is happening. Where is this sickness coming from? Where is it coming from? And you don't understand how is it being transmitted? Who gets it? Why doesn't everybody get it, but some people get it? Why do some people die very quickly? And you don't know, this is very important, you don't know how to protect yourself. Now, I mentioned earlier that when the Roman Empire collapsed, that there was like a complete collapse of the society. So one thing that I can immediately identify is the sewage system, because here we have open sewage. We have dirty water running in the streets. So this is not like antiquity. And then when people die, corpses are left out in the streets. Now let's think about that for a moment. In Judaism, what does the Torah say about that? The Torah says that you have to bury your corpses. So if in the Jewish community somebody dies, that person has to be buried. The body will not be just left around. What about hand washing? It's mandated in the Torah. The medieval man doesn't know that it would help. He doesn't know that washing your hands would help, but it's practiced by the Jews because it's in the Torah. The wealthy citizens, they escape, they leave the cities, they go to their country homes, and they decide they will wait it out, which now we know that that would be a very good way of avoiding infection. But the poorer people, they have no such possibility. So we have this society where the church is very powerful, but people are not reading the Bible themselves. They rely on the priests. There is such a fear in that society, and it's not fear of God in the sense of just respecting God, but it's fear. People are living in fear of natural disasters, in fear of these terrible sicknesses, in fear of anything that might go wrong. And what is happening with Christianity at that time? So I mentioned that the church was becoming very corrupt, that the church was very rich, that some of the churchmen were living like princes. And these people who are living in this ignorance, they don't really understand the world around them. So I want you to consider now, just based on the time where we are living right now, what does a person think in that situation? And how do we know what they were thinking? Well, we know it from art, we know it from literature. We know that for years after Black Death, we have in art all these corpses. We have death present in art, but we also have literature. And they are thinking, is God punishing us? This has to be God punishing us. And now let's think about this for a moment, that God is punishing Europe. Europe is very Christian. People are living in such fear of God, and the church is having all this power. Why is God punishing them? That would be the next question you would think about. Why is God punishing us? There has to be a reason, something in my behavior or something in my neighbor's behavior. So they start thinking, Europe is very divided. Even though it's a Christian continent, there is a lot of fighting between different parts of Europe, different dukes, different countries, and the church actually is a big part of this fighting. It's not a topic now for this presentation, but the church is sometimes, maybe even most of the time, more like a political institution than a spiritual home. So this could be a reason. We are too divided. God doesn't like that. That's why he's punishing us. Then they think about the Crusades. And they think, well, we never actually did really well with the Crusades. When we didn't really manage to fight against the Muslims. We didn't really manage to kill everybody in Jerusalem. And they think maybe this is the reason. Maybe God is punishing us because of this. But the one natural element, the thought that comes very easily is, well, what about the Jews? They killed the Christ, and therefore God is punishing us because we allow the Jews to live in our midst. And they start saying, well, and now I'm giving you another variation of the blood libel. They start saying, Jews have poisoned the wells. We drink the water that the Jews have poisoned. So because anti-Judaism is so strong, this blood libel is of course believed. And there is this idea that like Jews have a perceived immunity, which we don't know if that really existed, although it could be for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So if you look at this picture, you see that the Jews are being burned. Many Jewish communities disappeared completely. There were mass burnings. And now think about the Holocaust and think about what happens in the crematoria. Think about that you have open pits in Auschwitz toward the end of the war where Jewish corpses are burned. And many researchers actually say that this was the precursor of the Holocaust. So Jews die during this period. They are the scapegoat. The scapegoat is always needed. And I want to say this, that even today, I think everybody of us knows that people are looking for a scapegoat. So Jews died of Black Death itself. They died of the sickness. We don't know how many. We don't know what's the percentage, how many died. But they also died as a result of this anti-Jewish violence in the mass burnings and in other such events. And then this picture actually shows that they were forced to leave. They were forced to wander. And that's why there were entire Jewish communities that just disappeared. Now this picture here, this is from the social media, and all of these, they are circulating. A lot of people are posting them. And what do we see here? We see the Jew as a virus. So the Jew is not just spreading the virus, but the Jew is a type of virus. Invisible, an enemy that you cannot quite see. You don't know how to get rid of them. The ultimate, the other. So when we use that term, the other, of course, means that somebody is different or somebody is kind of not included. But it's also a way for me to express that I belong with a certain group of people because there is somebody who is the other, somebody who is not part of that group, who is not like me. So why do we say that the Jews would be the ultimate other? I think their otherness, for me, I would understand that it's because you don't require the actual presence of the Jews in order for these ideas, like in this picture, to circulate. That is, you don't require the presence of a Jew to have anti-Semitism. And this is another very enduring, very old theme. And this is also now from COVID-19, this picture. And it's basically, the text is saying that if you look closer at COVID-19, at the virus, this is what you will see. And these are classical anti-Semitic, horrible faces. But in case that we should not understand what is the meaning, they are wearing kippah, yarmulke with the Star of David. And here, this is also from the social media. It's not a plague until it's blamed on Jews. And there you see the different colors of the viruses. So you have the Black Death, you have cholera, Spanish flu, and COVID-19. So this image of a Jew being a virus, and this is actually also very, very old. Jews have been called lice, amoebas, different worms, and so on. And they are also parasites. A parasite is somebody who doesn't work, who doesn't earn their living, and they just suck your life out of you. So this 1940 film that was made in Nazi Germany called Der ewige Jude, and this was a film that was supposedly documentary. It was made in such a style, but actually where Jews are shown as parasites. And ultimately, the suggestion is that what do you do with parasites? You kill them like you would kill rats. So basically, we have this hatred that persists. We come from antiquity to Middle Ages to Christian anti-Semitism, and then we come later to Enlightenment. And when we come to Enlightenment and Jews receive their civil rights, then we see these accusations of disloyalty, wealth, and influence. Then we have racial theories for First World War, and so on. So basically, I think we have clearly seen now that this anti-Semitism is very enduring and that it has always existed. And I'm going to end with this last slide. And I wrote something that is kind of like, I'm using two words that somehow are actually mutually exclusive, because I'm saying ongoing history. but history is in the past and ongoing is something that happens today. So what I'm saying is, and I want you to think about this, if there's some truth to this, that today during COVID-19, we see the same need for a scapegoat. And we see it very much in the social media. And when we are looking for a scapegoat, we actually go from rational to irrational. Because scapegoating is going to be based on very irrational fears, the fears that we have, suspicions, prejudices, and so on. And in our case, because I assume I'm talking to a Christian audience, we also have this question, how to interpret biblical prophecy. How does COVID-19 relate to the Bible? Is it something that we find in the Bible? And so on and so forth. And we have to be really very, very careful. I think we need to be very, very careful, even when we are interpreting the Bible and when we are trying to understand what happens at this moment. And my personal concern is that social media enables hatred. It's a wonderful tool and connects all of us, but whoever is using social media in sharing pictures, not knowing who originally posted them, why did they post that story, what do they want to do, there's no need to assume direct responsibility. And that's a problem, because maybe you would never say aloud the things you allow yourself to post, but then the post is going to reach far more people than anything you say ever would. So the final question, I don't mean to be provocative, but I do want to leave that question, is the question if we as Christians today, are we reverting to this medieval behavior? Are we looking for scapegoats? Are we looking to understand things in a very kind of suspicious way? Or are we trying to offer hope in an age that needs hope? So in my next session, I will move on and I will talk more about the conspiracy theories that are right now circling online. And we want to understand, how are these anti-Semitic? Why are they anti-Semitic? And then in the final session, we will actually look at the essence of things. How do we identify something as anti-Semitic? So thank you.
Thank you so much for that message, Susanna. Very important, particularly today. Now, before we move into our Q&A, there's a couple of points I'd like to bring to your attention. You'll need to type in your questions to Dr. Kokkonen at the bottom where you see that little chat sign. So type in your questions and we'll take those questions and pose them to her. But before we do so, I'd like to know if Donna, are you available there? Because you may want to make a comment or two before we move on to our Q&A concerning Susanna's message. And as she said, it was geared toward Christians, and a part of Christianity is soul searching at every level. And hate is completely opposite to the Christian message of love. And that is something that needs to be remembered. Donna, can you speak into Susanna's message today?
Well, Susanna gave a wonderful overview. It's horrible at the same time. To see that this still exists in a world such as ours is horrific. And there is a lot of ignorance that you're talking about ignorance here within the church body. When we present about it, pastors, leaders have not ever heard of the responsibility of the founding fathers. And as much as you say the dichotomy between someone like Martin Luther and the good that he did in the Reformation, that he actually turned against the Jews when they were not accepting of coming into the church as he felt that they would. So the hatred continues, but it is shocking that so many of us within the Christian body, at leadership and as attendees, are totally ignorant about this. And that we are willing to maybe share a lot of things on social media without really giving any consideration to who's propagating it, why they're doing it, what's the background of it. So, and in these times of COVID, we're spending way too much time. Our social media time has gone off, off the rails, and not in a good way, we should be all working for our masters and PhDs in something worthwhile. But that's my comment, is the ignorance and the longevity of this hatred, which is sin. It's sinful in the world. And what can we do today in light of it?
Very well said, Donna. Right now, Susanna, it looks like we have an audience that is just taking in your message. They don't seem to have a lot of questions right now, but I'd like to present one to you, because this is a lecture that I think is really needed. And I'm going to pick up from where Donna left off in the churches, because I think our Christian audience recognizes fully that we do not engage in any form of hatred. This is something that is just not a part of the Christian message. But at the same time, there is a fear out there to deal with this level of hatred. And I'd like if you could, perhaps, we have a question coming in, but if you could just answer this or give some guidelines on how Christians, or motivate Christians to seek information. And when they hear this kind of a hatred, what is a positive way they can begin to deal with this kind of a hatred that perhaps they're just not accustomed or used to hearing, so they tend to shut down?
I mean, I think there is a kind of fear many times at the church that if you go too deeply into these theologies and into these questions, like the two accusations against the Jews, that I find personally that some pastors might be slightly uncomfortable, that if the conversation gets very difficult, or they might not actually feel comfortable, or that they have all the information that they would need. And then I also think that a lot of people tend to think that this, work with Israel, that it's like its own kind of expertise or field. And I feel that somehow that's wrong, because I really believe that the whole church, we should all be supporting Israel, obviously, and we should understand our responsibility. But I think those are the main things that I see as preventing this, wider engagement. And I think it's so important that we keep educating, and I think ignorance is our enemy, because I think when you know more, there's no way that a rational person would not see what happened in history and what's happening today. But as to how to get to the church, how to be invited, and how to be able to educate, that obviously is not something that I would, be able to help you with. It's very hard.
You still gave a great guideline, Susanna. Thank you. And we do have a very good question that's coming in now. It says, at the same time, I find the Jewish people are fully informed about the anti-Semitic history of Christians. They still feel that we hold these views. Can you address that?
Yes, I mean, absolutely, because as Donna mentioned in the introduction, I worked for 10 years at the Yad Vashem, and I think, my colleagues and people who were visiting, I mean, I think almost that when they see you as a Christian, the first thing that they think is that you would be against them, or that you would have these very anti-Jewish views. But I do want to say something positive. I think that's changing a lot, because I think even in Israel during that time, those 10 years, I feel like there was a change. Christians were getting more and more positive coverage in the media. There were more and more Christian leaders who were not afraid to take a stand, or come to visit, even when there were almost no tourists coming in 2014, and so on and so forth. So I think that, like the only thing that you can really say when somebody says that is that you were not there and Christians today are different.
Yes.
Because we can't take responsibility for the past in that sense, but we have full responsibility for what's going on today. So,
well said. The next question, education is so needed. Why is the world so silent? And what can we as Christians do to help?
well, I mean, you are all already doing a lot because this is an ICEJ, organized meeting. So obviously, you are in the front lines in that sense that you are already, dedicating your lives to these issues and doing a lot. And I think it's more, how do we get more people to join us? How do we get more people to become part of this movement? But I do think that, the ICEJ reps are already doing so much.
Yes. Now, this next question, it's an important one because it addresses specifically scriptures, the text of scriptures, and there are many that may not know and they need guidance here. This is the question. I'm going to quote this person. Are there any specific scripture verses we can give to a pastor, a person in authority in the church that seems apathetic to the anti-Semitism that is prevalent in today's world of TV and social media?
Yes, I mean, definitely there are many specific scriptures, because I mean, what I have found myself often is that, of course, in the Old Testament, we have many scriptures. Of course, Genesis 12, and then all the way down to the prophets and Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and so on. But many times I found that there was a kind of suspicion that there's nothing in the New Testament about these issues. And some pastors still, would like to feel more comfortable having that. So I think that if you look at Luke 21, nothing could be clearer than Jesus predicting the destruction of the Second Temple, Jesus predicting the diaspora and the horrible things that will happen to the Jewish people, and Jesus saying that the times of the Gentiles will be ending. And that happens in 1967, obviously. So, I mean, for me personally, I feel like that, what Jesus says, that would be very, very strong. And then, of course, Romans 11, what we were just reading at the beginning, that we have to realize that we were crafted in the tree. And then finally, I want to say that if you look at Revelation chapter 5 and the very final chapter, you can see that Jesus is clearly identified as a Jew when he comes back. So why I'm saying that, because I think sometimes at the church, so if you look at Revelation 5 and you read right from the beginning, he's identified as the root of David and the Lion of the tribe of Judah. But then in the very final chapter of the Bible, which is Revelation 22, Jesus himself is speaking, and he calls himself the offspring of David. So what I believe is important, that we understand that when Jesus comes back, he's also coming back as a Jew, and that is important enough that it has to be in the final book of the Bible. And I think that's very important to tell the pastors.
Now, I'm going to shorten this one, and there's a technical reason why too, because it's a bit truncated on my version. But the gist of it is, it seems that some biblical scholars agree that even some New Testament writings have included anti-Semitism, anti-Pharisee, anti-law, Jewish enemies of the gospel, and this individual would like you to address that.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think what we do realize is that the New Testament was written, possibly with one exception, although even that's not certain, by Jews. So if a Jewish person is addressing the Pharisees or like a specific group, I do think that it's different them saying something than me as a Gentile maybe saying that same thing. I do believe that the New Testament is a kind of reflection of the culture and how things were expressed. And I kind of hesitate. I believe it's Word of God, so I hesitate to say that it would be anti-Semitic, but also because I see that even Paul, whatever he says, that he has this sorrow in his heart. He says that he would actually, go instead of them. I mean, it's very, very, like, you can sense that it's emotional and spiritual, and there's like a struggle going on. But I personally don't necessarily feel that it's anti-Semitic. I feel that it's more the Hebrew culture and the Jewish writers, addressing their fellow Jews in a way that, even in Israel today, you can say perhaps more aggressive things than you would in our culture. I don't see it quite that way.
Okay. Now, there's a fellow here that's saying that it's pretty much being answered here, because this person is talking about ignorance within the community and the Christian understanding of the Jews. So to broaden this, what would you suggest Christians could do to learn more about the Jews, Jewish history? I mean, of course, you're here today teaching that very subject, but do you have anywhere to perhaps point Christians that are tuned in today that are saying, look, I support Jews, but I'd like to be able to refer to more educational resources or any kind of a material where I could expand that knowledge and perhaps share it with Christian friends?
Well, I mean, if you are based in Canada, I think you have a lot of Jewish communities and community centers, and I know that the ICEJ already works with some of those. So, maybe even to go to visit, the Jewish community, maybe organize a lecture by a rabbi. I think there's a lot that you can do locally. Of course, visiting Israel is wonderful, because then you can really get into, the Jewish holidays and everything there. But I think that would be, and yes, I can see this message that just arrived. So let me say that, yes, my book would be a wonderful source.
Do you happen to have a copy of that book that you could hold up for us there while we're on that subject? Yes, so please take note of that book. Take note of the title, and it's a great resource unto itself. Now, Susanna, we're running out of time here. One of the questions came in about my book, but I'm sorry to tell you, it is not about my book today. So we're going to have to bypass that question, but thank you for that interest. Susanna, before we move on, I have a question of my own that I'd like to ask, because it's very troubling to me. There is, and this is not to politicize the issue, of course. It is to get deeper into the issue and be able to give the Christian church some guidelines on how to deal with this matter in love. There's a center in Israel called the Sabeel Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center. And we know the kind of message that comes out. It presents Israel as being the aggressor, as being an apartheid state. And it presents the Palestinians as being victimized by Israel. And due to the inherent message of love within the church, a lot of major denominations and organizations tend to go along with Sabeel's message of liberation theology. And this is an issue that is haunting the church today, and it's caused a dramatic shift and split. And I would like to know what your recommendation is, Susanna, to deal with that kind of an issue that really cannot be ignored today in the world.
Well, first of all, when we are talking about Bethlehem and we are talking about Palestinian Christians, I do know that we have some Palestinian Christian pastors and leaders who don't agree with Sabeel. So I think one way would be just to connect people and get them to hear or meet with these other pastors who would be able to talk about how is it to live under the Palestinian Authority and what is really happening there. Because what happens with Sabeel is that they want to give a certain kind of very political message, and their message is very obviously very anti-Israel, and there are very complex reasons behind that. It's not easy to live in that kind of society, and it's probably easier for a Christian if they just you know, kind of give public sympathy to the system, to whoever is in charge. And we have that concept in Islam called dhimmi, you know, living under Islam in a protected kind of status, and that's kind of that kind of mentality. But in order to fight against it, or in order to educate people that what's really happening, I think you need to enlist maybe these believers on that side who are willing to actually to talk about their experiences, because it's a horrific reality what really happens there.
Susanna, can we separate before we close? And I know that many of you have given excellent comments. Just to let those of you know who is watching, there are many comments coming in complimenting you, Susanna.
Thank you.
I think it's a great message, and they're eager to give their opinion because they're so driven by your message. So we want to thank you so much for sparking that interest in people. But one final question that I know is in the hearts of both Christians and the Jewish people, that I've heard a lot come up in my particular world of writings, is: can we separate Israel, criticism of Israel, from the Jewish people?
Okay, so now I do need to say this, that there's a difference between criticism and demonizing. And so what happens very often, if I'm criticizing another country, if I'm criticizing Canada, am I also criticizing European countries for that same thing? Am I also criticizing the United States, whatever? Or am I just focusing on that one country with no apparent reason? So what happens with Israel is that people who are talking about social justice or human rights, very often they are focusing on Israel's supposed human rights violations, but they have no regard to what's happening in Iraq or in Syria or in Libya or in any number of countries around the world. And when we come to that last session, when I talk about how do we know if something is anti-Semitic, well, I can already say that several governments, 34 governments, Canada is also part of that group, actually have defined this focus on Israel and not focusing on similar situations in other places as being anti-Semitic. So you cannot demonize the state of Israel, which is the Jewish state, without actually demonizing the Jews. That is what people say, that it's possible to hate Israel and not to hate the Jews, but that is a very artificial, distinction, and I don't think that that's possible. So if you criticize Israel and then you criticize in a normal way, you have a specific issue and you don't like it and you say something. But how often do we really criticize foreign countries if they are democracies? You know, how focused are we in that? And I do say that Israel is getting all this criticism from all directions, and it's no longer just criticism, it actually is anti-Semitic.
Yes, it's a gang up, Susanna. Susanna, it was so exciting featuring you today. I'm afraid we could have you for another hour, but we're running out of time swiftly. So again, thank you from all of us for joining us. Very informative, and we certainly appreciate your time and your expertise on the subject and educating us. It's especially needed now. Now, for those of you watching, we're sorry for those who we couldn't get to the question, maybe next time. Next week, we'll cover the important topic of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, from the protocols of the Elders of Zion right up to the current day COVID-19.
Mhm.
And I believe that brings us, I'm asking the team here to a close today. So if any of you want to jump in and say something quick, otherwise we thank you and we could end our session for today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna.
Thank you.